Hey there. As the evening deepens and the hum of the day retreats into gentle shadows, let me take you somewhere few outsiders have truly seen, a place where the mountain winds carry secrets and every stone remembers. Imagine you're nestled in, eyes growing heavy, yet behind them a flicker of anticipation. Because tonight's story will unveil a moment so often overlooked, it altered the fate of millions. I promise, by the time we reach the valley's heart, a single question will echo back. Why did no one listen? If stories of quiet warning and irreversible turning points hold you, then maybe you'll want more nights like this. And since we gather from every corner, whether city light or countryside quiet, drop into the comments and share your midnight, your dawn, or whatever hour you find yourself pausing for a tale. Now, dim the lights, fold yourself into comfort, and let's begin this journey together, halfway across the world, and years before a morning changed everything. The first time I entered the Panjshir Valley, a wall of stinging wind drove powdered grit against my face. From the window of our battered jeep, the ragged banners of Massoud's Northern Alliance snapped above sandbagged outposts, their colors muted beneath the late winter sky. We wound past rockfalls and battered Soviet tanks, sentinels from the last failed campaign in these mountains. I came as a Western liaison, my military insignia tucked discreetly inside my chest pocket. The world behind the city gates of Kabul seemed to fade as the Panjshir's stone ramparts closed in. Every step carried the hush of coming confrontation. The sound of distant gunfire carried fog, thin over the wind, indistinguishable from memory. No one spoke of what waited above the passes, only the tension in the air, and fleeting glances traded between Afghan fighters told me that Massoud's war and his warnings had already outpaced the cautious briefings from home. There are certain places that press memory into your bones. Panjshir was one of them. Dust would settle in the creases of your skin, and the metallic scent of spent cartridges mingled with rough green tea and the faint sweetness of oranges saved for rare guests. The men by Massoud's side warmed their hands over sputtering stoves, their voices low, words often clipped and wary, cautious with trust. Even then, I'd heard legends about the Lion of Panjshir, the fighter general who outfoxed one Soviet general after another, and whose gaze could cut straight through artifice. As our jeep lurched to a halt outside the headquarters, sunlight fractured over a clutch of battered command vehicles. The sky above the valley narrowed to a Dreiser blue, unforgiving sliver, knife sharp and clean. Inside, the headquarters shuddered against the wind. Paper maps hung limp beside radios that spat static, and somewhere above, a field telephone jangled with a note of alarm. The anxious silence gave way to voices, Pashto, Dari, then the murmured English they reserved for foreigners like me. My interpreter, Kamal, jerked his chin toward a heavy canvas partition. Behind it, boots crunched stone. Here was the heart of the resistance, Massoud's nerve center, where hope pressed against odds so long you could taste the bitterness in your mouth. Momentum built with each hour. Massoud's fighters, many barely more than boys, watched me with eyes too serious for their age. One of them fiddled with the battered radio, picking up a signal full of static and coded names. They were listening for any scrap of warning, Taliban movement, artillery on the move, the distant hint of something darker threading through the region. The world outside the valley believed the war in Afghanistan was static, nothing more than tribal dust-up, a distant headline. But inside this rock-bound outpost, history pulsed under the surface. I had come hoping to bring assurances, yet each shift of wind seemed to sweep those words away. Useless platitudes, when mortars might fall as soon as midnight. I still remember the way fatigue pulled at Massoud's soldiers, how some tucked their prayer beads into their vests, as if that alone could keep them safe. The clatter of weapons at the door set my nerves alight, a reflex drawn from too many briefings about insurgency and sabotage. One night, one of the French attachés quietly handed me a folded note, its contents written in hurried, slanted English. Massoud has intelligence. Urgent. Not just Taliban. Something coming from the south, foreign fighters, and coded signals not heard before. The Frenchman's thumb quivered along the edge of the paper. You must tell Washington. He probably guessed, as I did, that the message would travel through more hands than ears willing to listen. Evening crept down the jagged ridgelines as we reviewed maps under the dim glow of an oil lamp, trying to decipher the lines Massoud traced with his finger. Ambushes to the south, rumors of unfamiliar accents among the enemy dead, strange money changing hands where it ought not to be found. The gallery of fighters huddled closer, as though they could keep the world at bay by sheer force of will. The question pressed in. What were we missing? The more I watched Massoud's face, the more I realized he was reading the air for unseen storms. At the far end of the headquarters, a battered Soviet helmet hung from a nail, the steel worn thin by time and by the constant shifting of hope and strategy. I caught sight of it from my corner, a sudden reminder that empires had broken themselves upon these stones and left only ghosts. Outside, the wind howled with a kind of memory. That night, I dreamed of gunfire echoing from one end of the corridor to the other, as if the war had become a permanent undertone in my mind, chasing rest away. It would take weeks for the pattern to become clear. Sidelong warnings were passed in the valley, and when the ambassador from France stopped by, guarded by men with haunted eyes and scarves drawn up over their faces, urgency sparked anew. They argued quietly with the Americans, tension crackling over tea gone cold. The talk drifted from tactics to rumors of a visitor, someone connected far beyond the mountains, a messenger from a shadow world. Massoud seemed unable to shake. Every word that filtered through those walls felt weighted, brimming with things unsaid. I can feel the atmosphere of those nights even now, the hard floor, the distant boom of shelling that marked the shifting front, and the mounting suspicion that none of this was truly about the Panjshir anymore. Intelligence reports would arrive by dusty motorcycle or whispered through static-laced radio channels, but each seemed to grow more urgent. Some detailed camps and visitors far beyond Afghanistan's southern border. Others described names scarcely believed by those reading them. At one point, Kamal translated a passage in hushed tones. The enemy is gathering for something larger. Not just here, not just now. The question clung to me, gnawing through every layer of official assurance. Why did Massoud's warnings keep getting softened, siphoned away into routine? Why did the world's powerful listen only with half an ear? One bleak afternoon, artillery boomed along the valley's throat, rattling the windows. In that moment, I pressed my palm to the cold concrete and tried to gauge which way the conflict was breaking. Dust filtered in pale shafts through storm-shattered glass. That same day, I watched as Massoud handed a dossier to a Western official, a document thick with names and dates, details about terror training camps in the East, lists of men and money crossing invisible borders. The official folded it twice, spoke in the even, tired manner of a man with deadlines but no conviction, then shifted the conversation to aid logistics. The page went unread on his desk, edges curling with humidity and neglect. I can still see that unopened dossier, a silent condemnation lying abandoned beside a tin mug of bitter black tea. No one argued. The men simply resumed their hushed work, their silence louder than any accusation. Much later, as dusk bled into the rooms and the old radio called out with a new code, it struck me that irreversible turning points often announced themselves with nothing more than inattention. The wind never relented. Evenings in Panjshir would find me by the window, trying to sort the competing threads in my mind, fear and loyalty, the pull of home, and the quiet dread that history was tightening its grip. From somewhere across the compound, a boy's voice drifted up, a scrap of song rendered tinny and thin by distance. The sharp aroma of burning diesel clung to everything. Conversations would stall when someone mentioned names unfamiliar and dangerous. In every quiet moment, Massoud's warnings felt heavier, not lighter. We heard rumors of visitors from the south, faces seen only in fleeting glimpses near the city gates, bearing messages as opaque as the dust they stirred. Sometimes I caught a glint of anger in Massoud's eyes, the frustration of a man who saw disaster taking shape in the blind spot of the world's attention. I have carried the weight of those silent warnings ever since. There is a regret framed into every recollection. What would it have changed if someone had listened sooner? And yet, on the night before everything shifted, there was still one last moment, unexpected, raw, and electric, when Massoud himself emerged from the gloom, an unspoken decision tightening his frame. The full storm of what he tried to warn us about would only break later, far past the valley's gates. But the first tremor came as quietly as a door closing in the wind. That image still lingers whenever I recall Panjshir. And as Massoud entered the command shelter quietly, face marked by fatigue and the dust of 100 marches, the story deepened into the territory of things lost, and things the world can never quite forgive itself for. The Panjshir wind pricks at your face, a steady, needling force that seeps through seams and skin, refusing to be ignored. We huddled below ground, walls thick, air alive with the cold and the faint scent of old petrol. Massoud stood at the head of the table, shoulders sloped not from weakness, but from the relentless tug of responsibility. The battered map before him was scarred with grease pencil lines, a battlefield carved and recarved in his own careful hand. In that pale, flickering shelter, we were momentarily removed from Kabul's stifling bureaucracy and constant shuffle of diplomatic schedules. Here, everything was raw. The scrape of boots, the chill against the base of your neck, the low murmur of men waiting for orders that might send them into the teeth of the mountains. He spoke first to his lieutenants. They answered in clipped Dari, half whispers skittering like stones down a slope. When he turned to us, I noticed how the tension in the room lowered a fraction, but only just. There was a quiet mastery in the way he disarmed visitors, not with grand gestures, but by drawing their attention away from himself, forcing you to look, instead, at the terrain he expected you to understand. "Do you see how the lines move?" he asked, one finger tracing a trembling border on the map. His English carried the peculiar cadence of someone thinking in a language that offers no shortcuts. They think control is simple, one side, then the other. But nothing holds. It is a flood. It slips through the fingers. I remember wanting to believe there was a code I could crack if I just listened closely enough. But whatever certainty I had packed with me from London and Paris faded a little more with every word. Outside, the dull thud of distant artillery pressed against the valley's silence, time measured in echoes more than minutes. What cut deeper than any statistic or briefing note was Massoud's habit of returning to the same question, one that refused resolution: how long can Afghanistan stand alone? The world, he implied, had already weighed the price of intervention and walked away. Through the makeshift radios, fragments of intercepted chatter rattled, new Taliban units massing, fresh weapons arriving from just over the border. Massoud's eyes settled on me, the visiting diplomat who couldn't promise more than another cable to a half-listening capital. That is when the regret began to burn its way in. It is a feeling that forms slow, like frost around the heart. His warning drifted out in the measured hush that always fell once pleasantries were spent. They, his words deliberate, they will not stop at Kabul. And their friends, they do not wear uniforms, but they have the power to bring death far from here. In that lantern-lit hollow, Massoud's meaning was unmistakable. He was not speaking of ancient tribal feuds, but of men gathering strength in Pakistan, men whose plans stretched far beyond the labyrinthine valleys of Afghanistan. By then, Massoud's face seemed carved in shadows, creased beneath the weight of a frustration too old for his years. He gave not threats but prophecy, a warning voiced not for effect, but out of grim obligation. Outside, the mountain wind slithered beneath the weathered door. A rifle clattered in the corner as someone shifted his boots. Somewhere below us, a radio clicked over to a hiss of static, and the smell of boiled tea curled above chipped enamel cups. If you listened only to the official cables that month, you would have believed the world was turning in small, manageable increments. A new round of UN sanctions, a cautious telegram from Paris, a hasty intelligence summary from Washington citing little that hadn't been said before. But to sit across from Massoud was to feel the edge of the cliff beneath the world's feet, and to realize with mounting certainty that the step had already been taken. Most had simply not felt gravity's call yet. A knot settled in my stomach. I should have asked him more, should have pressed for specifics, dates, names, something actionable, something with enough weight to force a hand in Brussels or Langley. Instead, I sat caught by the conviction in his tone, the restraint that came not from a lack of knowledge, but from the futility of retelling what had already been said, again and again, to those unwilling to believe. An aide entered, breathless and dust-caked, and passed a battered folder to Massoud. He opened it with quick, workman-like fingers. Inside, scrawled in French and Dari, was a list of sightings, unfamiliar men at the crossroads near Charika, trucks unloading crates bearing Saudi labels, a rumor of an Arab voice heard among Taliban ranks, an artifact of intelligence, instantly puncturing the quiet anticipation in the room, setting the stakes in tactile relief. Something physical to carry, to lose, to misfile, to ignore. Out in the valley, the wind sharpened. The sun sank, smearing pinks and coppers across shattered ridgelines, dust coiling along the road to Kabul. For a moment, the HQ seemed a speck lost in the immensity, a gathering too small to steer the oncoming storm. This helplessness bristled even in the smallest actions, men lacing boots for the 100th time, an old radio operator tapping Morse out of habit, the chief of staff making promises that could not be kept. I asked Massoud what he wanted me to tell my superiors. It is easy to recall the cadence of his reply, if not the precise words. Tell them, if they wait, if they doubt, what is here will not stay here. His voice never rose, and it did not need to. There is a kind of silence that feels like failure, not just the failure of one man or one nation, but a collective closing of eyes. As Massoud prepared to leave, adjusting the wool scarf at his neck, he glanced at me again. There was resolve in him, yes, but also the resignation of someone who already knows which warnings will vanish into dust. I can still feel the rough grain of that table beneath my palms, the dull ache in my shoulders from hours tense with expectation, pretending to be patience. What is most unbearable is not what Massoud told us, but what he did not. The full inventory of risks, the hidden lives of those crossing borders with hatred stitched into their plans. By the time we stepped back above ground, darkness had swept the valley. The cold was absolute, scouring the mine clean, and the unmistakable staccato of rifle fire echoed up from the southern approach road. In that moment, I wondered if this was what history truly was, an assembly of missed chances, a record of unheard warnings carried on mountain winds. Back then, it was still possible, if only just, to believe the world could be jolted into action. But in my bones, I sensed the pivot had already occurred, irreversible as the night press against the high passes. Massoud's words sifted behind my eyes, all the way to Kabul, their urgency finding no purchase among the dust-choked city gates and locked embassy doors. And so, the unanswered question lingered, dogging my steps long after. Why did we let his warning become just another lost echo in the valley? The diplomatic enclave in Kabul was a fortress of routine and polite indifference. Kabul, from a distance, can almost be mistaken for a city at peace, sunlight catching the spires of the Shah, Doshamshira Mosque, young boys hawking sweets at the checkpoints, the drone of the city blending with the occasional laughter drifting from embassy courtyards. But if you listen longer, you notice the rhythm unsettles over every outburst, the brittle sound of wind scraping dust against walls, the distant tremor that could be thunder or far-off artillery. Each morning inside the enclave, routine returned in the ritual confirmation that our armored SUVs had survived the night intact. I remember the velvet blue of dawn and a burnt smell rolling in from the city dumps outside the gates, more acrid on some days than others, making my eyes sting. Guards with Kalashnikovs lounged beside planters that had once been green, hidden behind mirrored sunglasses, and the city gates clanged shut behind us, cutting off the full force of desert wind, if never its chill. Even the air inside the compound was never entirely free of dust. It lay thick on every windowsill, a constant, unremarked on-guest at every meeting. In those years, the Kabul diplomatic quarter was tightly circumscribed by fear, but shaped just as much by routine. Security briefings ran like clockwork, whether or not anything new had happened along the Panjshir front or in the tangled ruins of the Somali plain. Up in the resistance HQ, Massoud's fighters sent dispatches about Taliban movements, encrypted, sometimes little more than lists of names and times, sometimes something more dire. But by the time his warnings reached my desk, they'd been rinsed of urgency. Most of us in the enclave delivered reports to Paris or Washington or Berlin with a kind of hedged optimism. Every missive filtered through the same diplomatic lens, as if that could shield us from what kept coming. Massoud lingered in the talk at every off-the-record gathering, air thick with imported cigarettes, Russian vodka burning harsh as black tea poured too strong, his warnings weaving through the chatter. You could almost feel him pacing at the edge of every conversation, a faint, insistent shadow. More than once, I watched as another diplomat set down their fork and muttered that Massoud had gone too far this time, always predicting the worst. Terrorists on the move, foreign fighters in the foothills, a vision of radicalism enveloping the whole region. But the response always returned to arithmetic. Which border post was truly worth defending? Which humanitarian program most needed a signature? However persuasive Massoud's words, they seemed to dissolve once the dinner conversation wound down, replaced by talk of aid logistics and shifting alliances. From my own office, a cramped room with a grimy window facing east, I had a clear view of sunrise catching on the barbed wire. Each time I glanced back at the hissing fax machine, I caught the city flickering with movement, a wedding procession shouldering its way through dust, a lorry ablaze on the horizon after a night raid. Yet these interruptions rarely made the official log. I'd call up to the Panjshir Valley, my French stilted but urgent, and the voice on the line would remind me that another convoy had vanished in the passes. Always, the message returned to the same point. The threat is growing. But when those warnings reached headquarters, they seemed to warp under the fluorescent lights. I remember one morning, a senior official brushing off my attempt to escalate a new field report. "It's panic, not evidence," he insisted. The room crackled with the scrape of chair legs, the flutter of summary sheets. I pressed on, meeting silence only broken by the echo of gunfire somewhere beyond the concrete walls. There was an ambient sense of theatre among the diplomats, each grey-suited actor playing their part, while the real drama unfolded on a mountainous stage. They preferred to keep at arm's length. News of bombings or Taliban gains arrived almost abstract, like weather reports, to be digested over coffee and ignored before lunch. Those who followed Massoud's dispatches too closely risked accusations of bias, as though giving credence to Afghan resistance intelligence would break some invisible code. One evening, a gust of wind rattled the windows and set the lamps flickering. Electrical outages were common, but something about that night felt sharper, almost symbolic. The phone rang at the precise hour when the city beyond was most silent. Panicked voices cut through static, reporting another district lost outside of Takar. Paris wanted confirmation. But down the line, I heard the tired incredulity in Massoud's liaison's words. "We have been warning you since spring." Mondays often ended with what diplomats called coordination evenings, a fiction for stiff drinks and quietly desperate conversation. The air in our dining hall, thick as old felt, seemed constantly uneasy. A British attaché leaned in, voice hushed. "You know, if half of what Massoud warns turns out to be true, we're sitting on a powder keg." I nodded, fingering the fragment of shrapnel I kept in my pocket. Its edge was sharp as regret, a keepsake from a bombing that never made the official communiqué. That night, I wrote a cable describing the rising threat, but softened the tone at the last moment. By morning, that edit haunted me. If even we who believed him blurred the warning, what hope was there for officials further removed? A memory returns unbidden now, a trip to the main city gate with a new arrival from Paris. The gate itself rusted and battered, manned by guards in mismatched uniforms, but the real boundary was invisible. Fear, suspicion, the sense that anything might sweep down from the mountains at any moment. As we drew nearer, a convoy of refugees funneled past, eyes downcast, faces marked by red dust and exhaustion. My colleague, unused to the fetid air and the ever-present wind, asked if these scenes were common. I replied yes, but what I really meant was that they had become background noise, even for the ones tasked with paying attention. Reports kept arriving, handwritten, smudged, sometimes bundled with opium-laced bribes in a desperate bid for notice. But the distance from field to policy was measured not only in miles, but in the accumulated indifference of decades. More troubling still, I could feel myself becoming acclimated, bureaucracy as insulation, a way to slow the hum of fear. Sometimes, late at night, under the wavering beam of a failing lamp, I reread Massoud's latest communiqué. The words, stark and precise, seemed to cut through all the haze. Al-Qaeda forming closer bonds with the Taliban, signs of foreign financial support arriving through shadowy channels. Each line carried possibility and threat in equal measure. But if I attempted to escalate, the same objections bled through, voiced in gentle French or steely English. These are not our battles. Or worse, we have no appetite for another intervention. I tried, as a matter of duty and perhaps pride, to keep my own notes as raw as the original warnings. In the margin of one report, I translated a phrase Massoud often used: "Snow is not always white." It meant, in his idiom, that nothing could be trusted once the blizzards began. Loyalties, messages, even friends. That phrase lingered as Kabul's first winter wind arrived, carving new hollows out of the compound's old concrete. I looked out over the city and wondered what else we were failing to see. It is easy, much later, to imagine we might have moved faster, that a word more urgent in a single report, a meeting forced after midnight, might have shifted the course. But I know what it felt like to be there, half blinded, numb, more frightened by the scale of what we could not admit than by the shells falling in the north. My own regret, slow brewing and corrosive, has settled like another layer of dust. You convince yourself that diligence is enough, that someone above will act, until the next cable arrives, and it is already too late. Even now, I wonder, Did we begin losing our grip the first time we responded to a desperate transmission with a formulaic, measured reply? Or was the fault in the evenings we let Massoud be dismissed as alarmist, his name slipping through rooms like a rumor destined to fade? No one inside the enclave spoke of irreversible turning points. Not then. Not until they were behind us. And the mountain wind, relentless, found its way in, carrying the names of places we would soon lose, each syllable a warning unheeded, a promise forever broken. A battered folder waited near my cot in Panjshir HQ. Inside that battered folder, kept just a couple of feet from where I slept each night in the makeshift headquarters in Panjshir, sat Massoud's latest letter, a warning, penned in his measured Dari, his meaning translated roughly by Zahir, who spoke English in syllables thickened by mountain cold. The page was thin, hard used, its upper edge stained by someone's spilled tea, and the margins blurred where thumbs had pressed while passing the document along the row of war-room cots. If you held it up in the lamplight, you could see where the ink bled ever so slightly into the paper grain. That letter was not unique. There were a half-dozen just like it, each one carrying news of Taliban fighters swelling along the Shomali road, their lines thick with men and unfamiliar dialects. Foreigners gathering at the riverbanks, their edges sharper and more desperate by the week. It sounds strange, recalling it now, but what struck me most wasn't the language of alarm. It was the precision. He listed the numbers, the routes, the shadow of Thursday's convoy on the east track, so clearly I could picture the dust kicked up as if I was standing there. Every warning was a point on a map. Every foreign fighter reported not as rumor, but as a man glimpsed smoking by a rock or climbing into a truck under the wolf-grey moon. This wasn't hysteria or broad theatre. It was the daily, bone-tired vigilance of a man who had learned not to expect help. A vigilance scrawled and stored in paper sleeves, as if saving a life depended on the ink setting fast enough to be believed. One September morning, the year before everything changed, I watched a young French intelligence officer thumb through the folder. He pulled out the letter, scanned the marks left by Zahir's translation, then set it aside in favor of a commercial satellite image, pixels rendered in brutal monochrome. He read reports on concentrations, fuel stores, road conditions. The abstractions were clean, airless, immune to the anxiety that lived in Massoud's lines. Nothing actionable, he said quietly, folding the image flat. It wasn't indifference, it was a habit, worn as smooth as the desk's corners. Analytical preference ward off the urgency, trading the feel of wind and dust for the certainty of grayscale, shrinking every horror to a set of coordinates. Dust gathered on the window ledge in silent tribute to that neglect. I remember that sense of slow calcification. Every day, the distance between paper and reality seemed to widen, even as the air outside stank of diesel and sweat from convoys that had no business in these mountain passes. The hum of the generator rose, fell, faltered. Somewhere in the courtyard, a boy kicked at a rusted can, punctuating the silence with a hollow clatter. I found myself rehearsing arguments I could never quite make to my own colleagues. There was always something more pressing, some other priority. The world's great chessboard shifting again by invisible hands. The tea in the chipped mug grew cool in my palms. I read Massoud's letter again, trying to divine what words might finally land. The warnings kept coming. Evenings in the diplomatic enclave in Kabul brought their own tension. Dust choking the city gates, the echoes of distant gunfire traveling through the thin hotel walls. News filtered in. Massoud's men had intercepted a cache of medical supplies marked for a hospital that no longer existed. The logo of a well-known aid agency smudged beneath a thumbprint, more evidence that something larger was being orchestrated far beyond our line of sight. I would see French, British, and American staffers huddle in quiet corners, speaking in clipped phrases, eyes darting to the windows. Still, when the folder changed hands, it rarely stayed open for long. Fatigue fobbed every conversation, and for all the talk of duty, almost no one believed there would be a reckoning so close at hand. This indifference was invisible, not etched in a single act, but ground into the fabric of each day, a cumulative blindness. Then came the detail that keeps me awake at night. 2 weeks before the attacks, a runner handed off an envelope that should have stopped every plan in its tracks. Inside, names, nationalities, supply routes, an entire network visible if you simply bothered to connect the dots. It was all there, flattened by the slow hand of protocol, filed and forgotten. I recall the metallic bite of the clip that held the papers together. With a chill, it struck me that the warnings were not simply ignored, but neutralized, the urgency smothered by process. I'm not sure if those pages were ever read again before the world changed. I wish I could say that was when I started to understand Massoud himself, not just as a leader, but as a man misjudged by almost everyone who met him. When I visited him in Panjshir, the mountain wind hissed through the cracks in the window frame, and the cold pressed hard against the glass. He welcomed me with the formal reserve of a soldier who knows he is being studied. Yet, in quiet moments, his words pierced through the insulation of diplomatic language. "You come here and see our faces and count our rifles," he said once, as we sipped bitter green tea gone lukewarm. "But do you know who else walks these roads at night? The danger is not only for us." He had a habit, a sort of restless motion, of glancing at the radio every so often, as if waiting for something more urgent than our conversation. Later, when he left the room, I trailed my hand against the rough mud wall, feeling the chill that seemed to radiate from the earth itself. There was a line we never crossed, that silent admission that the West's concern ended at the city's edge. His frustration echoed in the questions that still tightened my throat. Why did no one listen? Why did we prefer the grainy comfort of a satellite image to the crackling truth of his voice? That night in Panjshir, the air howled so fiercely that it rattled every loose shutter on headquarters. I lay awake, replaying the evening's conversation, the warning in Massoud's tone threading through my thoughts. There was still time then, hours, maybe days, before the last irreversible turn. But in that darkness, the folder rested undisturbed, its contents already becoming sediment beneath the weight of what would come next. Twilight in Panjshir arrived harsh and sudden, bearing new shadows. Twilight descended on the Panjshir Valley without ceremony. One moment the peaks were etched in raw blue light, and in the next they were lost, drowned behind a wall of mountain shadow. The wind clawed at the eaves above us, thinning the meager warmth from our hands as we huddled close to the battered table. The fighters lounged with a deliberate, bone-wearied ease, though each, I sensed, had a rifle within arm's reach. My interpreter's voice floated between languages, wrestling Afghan idioms into clipped English for my benefit. Above the rim of my chipped cup, I watched a young commander dig thumb and forefinger into a pouch of stale bread, eyes locked on the dark behind our gathering, as if expecting danger to announce itself with footsteps rather than with the silent drift of ash from the courtyard fires. Outside the walls, the valley was restless. One of those nights when every gust sent dust spinning through the arched gateways, coating boots and broadcast equipment alike. Word of the Taliban, spoken in barely suppressed tones, traveled faster than any of our convoys. I felt the shape of their story more than I'd grasped its details, clues stitched in uneasy silences after certain names passed through the room. When I urged them for clarity, routes, numbers, unique insignia, what I received was a latticework of shrugged shoulders, old wounds, and laughter cracked with exhaustion. "Tomorrow, maybe," one old fighter muttered, as if tomorrow itself could be trusted, or as if explanation should be rationed by the rationing of hope. The Americans, I'd learned, were only ever half present here, ghosts who sent requests for assessments, and then buried whatever didn't fit the brief. Too many in the West, my colleagues from embassies ringing the outer neighborhoods of Kabul, to the analysts peering at satellite feeds in Paris, clung to neat diagrams of Afghanistan. Every district a box, every actor catalogued with a 3-letter code. But on this ground, alliances' shape shifted as swiftly as seasonal floods, washing villages and friendships away with no warning, no regard for record. I wrote reports from a small desk beside a cracked pane, fingers tracing the path of newsprint already curling under the grit-laden wind, and I knew, though I'd never have admitted it then, how little I truly understood. Outside, the signal fires flickered low, casting erratic shadows onto gnarled tree trunks and the slow churning smoke. The men talked of covert convoys threading the back roads from the Durand line, trailing dust swirls that could only mean ammunition, crates stamped with markings no one bothered to translate, inventory gestures in a conflict where the only surety was the next dawn. It struck me, with the cold that cut beneath my scarf, that we had all begun to speak of the Taliban, not as rumor but as inevitability, a tide amassing at the borders, pulling strength from sponsors our governments preferred not to name aloud. One commander, cheeks hollowed by fatigue, drew a faint line in the dirt with his boot. He rattled off the names of checkpoints slipping out of contact. "They come at night now," he whispered, voice strangled by both pride and the ache of nostalgia. "Once there were promises, now they have friends we cannot see." His gaze flipped to me. "Your diplomats, do they know what's coming?" I almost lied. God forgive me. I nearly said yes. Instead, I offered the only half-truth I could muster, that Washington and London and Paris still saw Afghanistan as a jigsaw puzzle, the edges easy to find, the whole negotiable, if only someone clever enough could fit the pieces together. The idea that the Taliban had become more than just a patchwork insurgency, that it possessed the mechanism and will to redraw the map of power here, was not yet part of the official brief. We, outside experts, filtered our warnings through language made cautious by distance. I remember the sharp scent of burnt tea, and the way the wind, moments later, swept the scent away. I recall the radio, muttering from its battered shell, spitting out static and snatches of dari, news of skirmishes, the border writhing with unrest, rumors of foreign money drifting in with the late summer thunderclouds. Every so often, a name would break through the noise. Massoud. He was spoken of with weathered reverence, the Lion of Panjshir, a man who still believed in the possibility of resistance. Yet, even Massoud's sharpest warnings, relayed across mountain radios and through clandestine envoys, seemed to dissolve en route to the polished floors of foreign embassies. The reality, I saw now, was that danger here didn't travel in a straight line. It bled in from the margins, a convoy one day, an ambush the next. I'd seen telegrams arrive stamped with the insignia of Paris, their language oblique, inquiries disguised as polite concern. Did the Taliban pose a strategic threat? Could Massoud be trusted? The bureaucracy swirled on, thick as dust through embassy windows. Each new memo, meant to clarify, only further blurred the horizon between friend and foe. Around us, the men dropped their voices for the stories that really mattered. Childhoods upended, villages lost, the echo of distant gunfire that no one truly grew used to. Through my interpreter, a young fighter told how he'd watched unfamiliar soldiers pass by in the moonlight, their uniforms dusty, but their weapons pristine, the markings on the crates, foreign and unreadable. Every time I see new supplies, I know we are not fighting just the men in front of us, he said, but the men behind them far away, in places where these winds and these ashes were never meant to reach. As the night deepened, I found myself haunted by a flickering, intrusive regret. There were warnings dying in the harsh mountain winds, truths lost somewhere between the choked city gates and the walls of Kabul's diplomatic neighborhoods. Massoud's appeals, his meticulous descriptions of Taliban tactics, his lists of villages already fallen, his predictions of an iron tide sweeping up from the Pakistani frontier, were relayed again and again, yet never quite believed. At every embassy reception, someone would quietly question his motives, his reliability, as if the man's charisma both validated and undermined his message at once. What, I sometimes wondered, did we really need in order to act? The proof arrived daily: crated ammunition, intercepted dispatches, the visible shrinking of the ground held by resistance forces. Yet, in Washington and Paris, even as urgent cables arrived by pouch, leadership hesitated, a paralysis that passed itself off as prudence. There was always another meeting, a further review, a new chain of approvals. By the time a warning became policy, history had already ground forward, unmoved by our careful deliberations. I still see the moment, illuminated in the low, red light of a sputtering kerosene lamp, when an old intelligence officer handed me a folded slip of paper. The edges were soft with handling, the ink smudged by sweat, but the message was unmistakable. Names, dates, routes into Kabul, evidence that the Taliban, far from being fractured, were organizing for a decisive blow. That slip of paper made its way to diplomatic pouches, then up the chain, where doubt and delay eroded its clarity. Months later, when the world recoiled at the scale of what was wrought, I saw those names replayed on a television in Brussels, and felt the bitter aftertaste of missed opportunity linger in my throat. Still, in the Panjshir night, the conversations turned. A younger fighter, no older than my own nephew, stared into the embers. "You ask why we never give specifics," he said, picking at the calluses on his palm. "It's not that we don't know the answers. It's that no one believes us when we tell them." He glanced up, meeting my eyes squarely across the soft hush of the wind. "Maybe no one wants to. Did we listen too late? Or not at all? Even now, the question haunts me, its answer carried, unresolved, in every curl of wood smoke, fleeing before that implacable mountain wind. Out in the valley, fires sputtered and died. Ash sifted through the air, tangling with the scent of coming rain. Somewhere outside, a last radio call stuttered into silence. Above, the first sullen growls of a storm began to echo along the ridgelines. I stood, hand pressed to the battered door, poised on the threshold where regret and realization meet. Everything else, the unanswered memos, the warnings buried beneath caution and compromise, felt suddenly, achingly irreversible. That night, a storm crashed through the valley, lightning torching the sky above, shattered ridgelines, rain driving rivers of mud beneath the command post's battered door. The storm crackled so violently that the bunker seemed to shudder on its foundations. I remember the smell of ozone and diesel, the whisper of water creeping through fractured stone, and the low rumble of thunder tracing the valley's broken spine. Rain hammered the steel roof as if pressed by 1,000 invisible hands. Inside, Massoud leaned over a battered oil lamp, its flickering yellow breath underscoring the urgency in his voice. Shadows painted across his face made it seem like he wore a second, sterner mask for moments like this. The room was cramped, ringed with sandbags and the remnants of shattered radios, some with wires stripped, others marked by the soot of old explosions. His lieutenants waited, tension threading the air. I could hear my own pulse in the silence before he started to speak. Outside, lightning briefly revealed mountains dragged from nothingness, peaks jagged above swirling mist, and the patter of gunfire rolled in from some distant post, dulled by rain and fear alike. Massoud laid a sheet of wrinkled paper on the table. His fingers bore the stains of map ink and the slick of gun oil. He read from a list, the names and movements barely audible above the wind. Each name snapped through the room like a thrown stone. None were familiar to me. But that was exactly the point, he said quietly in Dari, translated word by word. Some of these men did not officially exist, not even in the enemy's archives. Their presence in Kandahar, their links to foreign camps, their command of new resources, all of it signaled something that outstripped routine conflict. He paused and looked directly at me then. There was a trace of resignation in his eyes, as if he knew these warnings would be greeted with skepticism, or, worse, silence beyond these walls. I scribbled my own notes, half in diplomatic shorthand, half in soldier slang. The room smelled of damp wool, old fear, cigarette smoke. When Massoud switched the radio off, only the soft ticking of the rain remained. This was not abstract intelligence being shared. These were coordinates, intercepted phrases, references to foreign-minted currency moving east into the hills. Someone, somewhere, was building a bridge between Afghanistan's private hell and the untroubled streets of distant capitals. A new shadow had entered the chessboard. Massoud delivered it all with the cold clarity of a man unburdened by hope. At intervals, thunder shook the door. One of the younger commanders whispered about an intercepted call from Quetta, men with Egyptian accents passing through, their journeys paid in crisp new dollars. Eyes darted around the table. Another, the oldest among them, tapped his fingers against the shaft of an unloaded rifle and muttered about Saudis seen in the markets, men who kept to themselves except at night. As the details stacked up, the very air inside the bunker seemed to thicken. You could feel it in your mouth, the taste of copper and fear. I should have pressed harder then, but even I, who had seen more than my share of desperate intelligence reports and warnings that vanished into bureaucratic oblivion, struggled to weigh just how vivid and interconnected the threats really were. I asked Massoud, quietly, what exactly he wanted me to take back to the diplomatic compound in Kabul. He fixed me with a stare that cut through language, eyes that had seen empires collapse and promises evaporate. "Tell them," he said, "not just about the Taliban, but about something larger gathering under that name. An alliance that included men with no stake in Afghanistan, their motives irretrievably foreign." His voice, so often gravelly and measured, sharpened to a whisper. He warned that the world's line of defense no longer lay at the Panjshir gates, but within the shadows now stretching toward the west itself. The men on his list, he insisted, were not planning to storm Afghan districts. They were sowing seeds for a storm beyond any border we recognized in Geneva or Paris. He traced a finger along the edge of the table, stirring up fine grit and a mouse's skull the wind had deposited there weeks before. The microcosm spoke for Afghanistan itself, battered, forgotten, but crawling with overlooked signs of something coming. A shell burst far away, muffled by the storm and mountains, but it served as punctuation for his prediction. The mood grew electric, as if we were listening for patterns in the static and the rain. My own hands ached from the cold, and I tried to imagine relaying this message in the measured tones of embassy cables. I had learned, sometimes the hard way, that messages delivered in panic seldom survived the journey. As the night wore on, we huddled tighter, sharing tea that tasted of iron and earth, while Massoud spelled out the relationships he'd traced. Saudis who funded training camps east of Jalalabad, Yemeni fighters slipping over the land like shadows, and Europeans whose presence was felt only in the wake of new weapons and unfamiliar dialects overheard by village children. He drew no lines between local and foreign. It was all a tangle. I realized that night his intelligence was broader and deeper than anything back in the Kabul diplomatic enclave. Out there, protocol reigned. Here, you learned to trust the patterns in a muddy bootprint or the flicker of coded Morse on a battered receiver. Midway through, the youngest commander produced the stained envelope, still smelling of motor oil and burnt paper. Inside, a brief, hastily translated code fragment referred to a western city, one I would not hear spoken in official briefings until it was too late. Massoud made no show of bravado. He only sighed and asked if anyone would finally listen, if the warning was spoken in English, in French, or in the blood on the mountains. By then, the rain had lessened, but the atmosphere was suffocating. We all sensed the world had tilted, even if the rest of Kabul would wake the next morning to the usual thrum of markets, the haze of traffic, and the distant echo of small arms fire. I watched Massoud fold the paper away into a battered satchel, his gestures slow, tired. I tried to reassure him. I would convey everything I had heard, stress the urgency, press the connection to foreign dangers. But in my mind, doubt gnawed at me. Would anyone in the embassy, or beyond, believe the scale of the menace? Would they see Massoud as more than just a local warlord pleading for aid? As the lamplight flickered lower, I lingered on a single moment. Massoud staring into the middle distance, as if already preparing for a future neither of us could control. He looked older in that moment, lines deepened by stormlight, resolve chilled by memories of past betrayals. There was more to ask, more that I should have said, but the night closed over us with the certainty only hindsight bestows. The whine of a generator faltered, briefly plunging us into a hungry darkness. It is this moment I often remember above all others: the commander's silhouette cut by candlelight, the rustle of maps, the knowledge sitting on that table like an unclaimed mine. Every warning suddenly felt like a last chance. So many years later, I still find myself haunted by the irony, the detail that I withheld that night, cross-referencing for accuracy rather than trusting the gravity of Massoud's tone. That fragment about foreign operatives? I wanted more proof, one more signal. I hesitated. When I finally presented the case, details had already dulled. Who else hesitated, I sometimes wonder, trying to balance the risk of false alarms against the cost of inaction? How many warnings died in translation or in the shadows between raid and report? As the rain stopped, the mountain winds returned, howling through gaps in the bunker, carrying away the residue of everything that had gone unsaid. Outside, lightning still flickered, refracted in puddles and mud. I watched Massoud gather his men, signals exchanged in code and gesture, preparing once again for a war the world pretended was someone else's problem. Above us, high on the ridgeline, the wind ripped a twisted flag to rags. Back in Kabul, the city awoke to the static thrum of daily commerce, governors plotting the day's alliances, the distant buzz of diplomatic radio. It felt like another world, insulated from everything I had witnessed under storm and gunfire. But I carried those names and warnings with me, even as the dust and diesel haze of the city swallowed their echoes, unanswered, unresolved. Kabul never truly slept in those years. By night, the city pulsed with anxious tension, a patient listening for a knock at the door that would mean everything had changed. By day, the diplomatic quarters flickered with a manufactured calm, fragile and absurd in its persistence against the winds that carried news of death down from the mountains. I remember stepping through the dust-choked gate of our compound that morning, jacket flapping in the stiff breeze, boots scraping dust off polished tile. The air vibrated with a faint, ever-present hum from the generator, punctuated by the bark of distant gunfire echoing from neighborhoods that never saw patrols after sundown. The Western embassies in Kabul were relics, their walls layered with the bland decorum of meetings and memoranda, the paint forever peeling beneath a veneer of imported order. I carried my morning coffee through a warren of sun-bleached corridors, noting the hush that signaled another round table, diplomats, intelligence liaisons, aides in crisp shirts, half unpacked after sleepless travel. We gathered that morning around a polished table, battered by the years and the staccato thump of the war unfolding, just beyond the city. In the filtered wash of sunlight, a senior official from Europe began outlining yesterday's security update. Panjshir remains stable, Taliban movement noted. Risk assessment unchanged. Destabilization, yes, but local, not global. These are tribal matters. No real transnational threat here. His voice was clipped, certain. I could smell the tang of instant coffee mixing with sweat and hot dust, wafting in through the slightly open window. My own notes had been constructed line by line in the field, double-checked among crumbling picket fences in the valley, the ink running from days in the cold. Commander Massoud's warnings still rang in my ears. These Taliban supply lines were more than rumor. Something far larger was being assembled east of us, outside our line of sight. I tried to push back, speaking up. Massoud is not some provincial warlord. He has mapped the contour of this threat, named it. The patterns are clear. We are tracking financial and material flows from outside Afghanistan. This isn't a border issue. This is the formation of a transnational network. I remember the look that flickered across the official's face, something between exasperation and fatigue. We've seen reports like this before. One commander's alarm is another's bid for influence. Nearby, a NATO liaison, face shadowed by late nights and too many briefings, tapped his pen on a closed notepad. He offered a slow nod, not in agreement, but in the rhythm of survival. Play along, keep the minutes moving, let the machinery of procedure dull the edge of unease. Filtering sunlight caught on the tip of his shoe as he shifted. The shudder of a passing truck made the glass rattle in its frame, pulling my mind for a moment to the jagged horizon beyond. Halfway down the table, one of the younger analysts, his lapel askew, quietly mentioned the Raveri report from northern Pakistan. Mentions of coordinated shipments, unusual nighttime movements, more satellite chatter than previous weeks. The room barely paused, the diplomat simply jotting a note and pushing a briefing folder further down the table. The conversation drifted back to procurement issues, as if the valley's warnings were little more than static. My protests, I could hear even then, blurred into the hum. They're building something new out there. It's not just the Taliban. The men Massoud described are not Pashtun, not Afghan at all. Those words sounded over the generator drone, thin and unconvincing when paired with the casual authority of dismissal. Outside, the wind picked up, sweeping a curtain of chalky dust across the glass. I caught sight of the Afghan tricolour flapping on a makeshift flagpole, splayed and battered. A motorcycle backfired on the avenue below. Inside this chamber, international policy was being drafted in language designed not to disturb an uneasy sleep. Routine, the notes read. Routine risk, routine response. But on this particular day, though it seemed like any other, I saw something that still unmoors me. At the far end of the table, amid a stack of briefing portfolios and unread memos, a telegram sat half-folded. The blue and grey envelope bore the stamp from the Panjshir Resistance HQ. Someone had left it unopened. Its edge flipped in just enough to reveal a few hasty lines in French and Dari. At the time, I barely registered this artifact. Crushed by meetings and the stifling weight of process, I never thought to pick it up. I would not understand what was in it until much, much later, when the crisis came to claim us all. Every instinct from my days in the military screamed for action. Ignore routine. Press for answers. Walk the unlit roads that connected Kabul's fragile calm to the valleys where battle still shaped the future. But inside the diplomatic enclave, a slow, silent inertia was working its magic. The city outside pulsed with rumors. Families bolted their doors before dusk. Armored convoys skidded past schoolchildren because word had come down of an ambush out by the old Soviet lines. Massoud's name was spoken in hushed tones, equal parts respect and fatalism. We in the West, I came to feel, held ourselves far above that current, insulated by protocol. Another scuffle at the checkpoint that evening. The guards, faces pinched in the receding light, argued with a courier who claimed to carry a message for one of our own. I watched from an upper window as the standoff played out beneath a scraggly tree, the wind clutching at everything not tied down. An Afghan boy dashed through the alley, sandals scraping stone. Even with the sun low, the air buzzed with warnings we refused to decode. Gunshots, engine growls, the acrid tang of burning plastic somewhere nearby. Later that night, as I sat on my cot under a single dangling bulb, the day's confusion pressed hard against my chest. If Massoud was right, and I felt now that he was, how many warnings had already been lost, cut off at the city gates, or stranded in unopened telegrams on polished tables? How many signals did we need before we would admit the map had changed, that we were blind? The echo of missed chances still rings in my ears years later. In that bleak season, faith in routines and the slow tyranny of paperwork had shielded us from terror at our doorstep. Why did we cling to the fiction that these were only local fires burning, that the line between Afghan valley and western city would hold? Was it the distance, or the comfortable hum of our own machinery that kept us from seeing the shape of disaster unraveling just outside our window? At dawn, in those last still hours before Kabul finally tore itself open, the embassy hallways glowed gold with false promise. I remembered then, as I still do now, how dust filtered everywhere, layering the floors, our jackets, the words we failed to speak aloud. Some warnings are too deep to hear over the sound of routine. Some signals arrive too late. Dawn pressed cold against Kabul's walls. The city behind us faded into the first ash-grey light, and the wind felt even sharper against my skin. On the drive from the diplomatic enclave to the Kate Barwan district, the patrol leader, a broad-shouldered Tajik with frost rimmed on his beard, kept his eyes locked ahead. He jabbed a finger toward a collapsed grove of mulberry trees, where I could just make out the skeletons of smashed jeeps half swallowed by brush. Their windshields had gone milky with cracks. The doors, left to swing and clatter in the wind. Two of his men slipped ahead, their boots leaving looping prints in the brittle dust. The valley's hush was interrupted by the low crackle of a transistor radio, tied on with fraying string to his belt, its green paint chipped to the metal. We waited beneath those twisted branches as dawn snuck up, pink and cold, over the horizon. That battered shortwave spat broken chatter, snatches of Pashto, then Urdu, rippling with urgency and something else I could barely pass. Shivered syllables, punctuated by laughter that sounded more like static than language. Somewhere beyond the next ridge, across a border drawn by maps and ignored by history, something was moving. I could almost taste the tension, sharp as brass in the back of my throat. Suddenly, the officer cocked his head. "They're cycling again," he muttered, words half swallowed by the wind. He twisted the dial with weathered fingers, chasing a signal as it danced in and out, like the echo of distant gunfire. There was talk of new material filtering into Taliban camps, funding, foreign operatives, steel boxes packed tight with ammunition. The names slipped past me, but the urgency did not. Somewhere, just miles away, another war moved on its own schedule, indifferent to the slow grind of diplomacy back in Kabul. I made notes in a pocketbook, sketching a map of connections, lines radiating from Pakistan into the grey dust of Afghanistan. The officer glanced at my writing, skeptical perhaps, wondering if any of it would matter. When the sun finally climbed high enough, lighting the stony hills with a dusty gold, the patrol folded their gear, pressed onward, leaving only tire tracks and the ghost of static hanging in the cold air. Back in Kabul, all this raw reality turned abstract, sanitized by embassy marble and the low drone of air conditioners battling the desert heat. The city itself seemed to live within a perpetual dust cloud that filtered sunlight to a jaundiced yellow. The gates choked by armored checkpoints, restless crowds, and the sound of generators humming out of tune. Diplomatic couriers hustled between offices, their shoes muffled on Persian rugs, their briefcases fat with folders that felt heavier than they looked. Every conversation seemed punctuated by the distant echo of gunfire, sometimes real, sometimes only memory. I found myself relaying what I had witnessed. Men with transistor radios, the tremble of excitement in Pashto phrases, the nervous glances, the whispered details about supply lines running unimpeded through the borderland dust. My words landed with a hush inside the consulate. My superior, an ambassador whose face always wore a mask of patient forbearance, nodded, then drifted back to paperwork stacked in neat, untouched towers. Their resolve, I suspected, had grown as brittle as the brush outside Jalalabad. Later that week, a telegram landed on my desk, its dull grey paper creased and marked by official seals. It recounted, in language both cautious and clipped, a summary of our field intercepts, growing Pakistani involvement, the sudden appearance of foreign trainers, whispers of a campaign that no one wanted to name. My report was appended as an afterthought. Subject: material support to local militant elements. Needs verification. Those last two words, needs verification, might as well have been a death sentence for Massoud's warnings. It was like watching a storm gather in the mountains and hearing only the silence that comes before it breaks. Even among the diplomatic circle, the reality of Pakistani influence filtered as rumor, always pushed aside by more convenient narratives. One evening, over lukewarm tea with a French attaché, I tried to explain what we'd heard by that border, the sense of something vast moving beyond our line of sight. He nodded, lips pursed, the soft golden lamplight doing nothing to smooth the worry in his eyes. "We all hear the warnings," he said, lowering his voice. "But only the dead are truly listened to." If I'm honest, sitting in that embassy office, I began to feel the edges of my own complicity. Each day my uniform, once stiff with purpose, grew softer, its meaning worn away by the bureaucratic cycle of warnings submitted and warnings ignored. I replayed the stilted conversations with Massoud's men, their eyes narrowed by sleepless nights, their hands always just inches from a radio or a rifle. The stakes were palpable to them. Here they dissolved into the faint click of a diplomat's pen, the shuffling of reports destined for a locked drawer. Still, sometimes, the city's atmosphere would produce a jolt. On the drive from the diplomatic enclave to the Kate Pawan district, my driver and I were halted at a checkpoint, soldiers with dust-caked boots motioning us to wait as gunfire thudded in the far-off hills. I remember a boy, no older than 15, standing next to a rusted sign that read, "No foreigners beyond this point." The look in his eyes lingered with me long after, a silent warning more lucid than anything I'd managed to put in my field dispatches. Why had we missed so many signals, not just on the technical level, but in the faces and voices of those trapped inside the fighting's concentric circles? The institution I served was built to rationalize. It preferred neat borders, schedules, and the comforting illusion that paper could contain reality. But Afghanistan, particularly in those years, was built of half-truths and winds that carried news faster than satellites ever could. One night, unable to sleep, I wandered the embassy gardens. Above me, the mountain sky was a torn tapestry, and in the dry wind I could hear a faint, persistent rattle, like the static of that border radio, forever replaying warnings that no one was prepared to accept. I kept one artifact from those days, a battered, sand-smoothed shell casing retrieved near the Pakistan border. Sometimes I pressed it into my palm, feeling the cold metal as a reminder that every missed warning, every deferred question, was paid for in blood and dust. The last time I rode through the Kabul gates before heading north again, I watched the checkpoint guards light small fires against the darkness and huddle close, eyes scanning every shadow. The embassy lights seemed paler that night, the city waiting for something that everyone sensed, but no one said aloud. It was here, in this junction of hush and wind, that I first realized how irreversible some turning points were. Even with every warning spelled out in midnight ink, nothing had changed except the sense of approaching calamity. That feeling haunted every mile back to Panjshir, pressing heavier with each gust of mountain wind. The last time I met Massoud, evening pressed against the Panjshir command post like a sealant. Twilight in Panjshir has a sharp metallic edge that settles on your skin like the aftertaste of spent gunpowder. The wind that night was unforgiving and impatient, scattering the last rays of sun and the hope that clung to torn banners over the command post. I remember my boots grinding over grit, the valley's silence broken only by the telltale bark of distant rifles somewhere beyond the dark ridgelines. I had come, once again, as both observer and messenger, a role that grew heavier with each failed plea to my own government back in the green, ordered streets of Europe. Massoud looked as if he'd been carved deeper overnight, his frame wrapped tight in the scarf that never managed to hide the tension coiled beneath. His tent was barely lit, the lamp sputtering. When he motioned for privacy, his hand trembled, but his eyes, those unwavering slate-blue eyes, locked onto mine with a ferocity I had not seen since the early days of the resistance. He waited until the guards drifted away in the wind's howl before lowering his voice. "The Taliban is not the disease, but a symptom," he told me, words pressed between us like secrets that might shatter if spoken too loudly. Al-Qaeda flows around them. If the world waits, it will not be able to contain their reach. Then, almost too quickly, He produced it, a battered dossier, pages bound with cord, ink blurring at the touch. He did not release it to me right away. Instead, he held it close, explaining what was inside. Intercepted communiques, names, some bold, some buried, splintered networks tracing beyond the mountains I could see. He claimed these alliances were not speculation, not folklore, but mapped with chilling precision. This was a man offering not just intelligence, but a warning shaped by the weight of every friend he'd lost to the valley's cruel calculus. I can still feel the sting of my own hesitation. Diplomats are trained to carry messages without adopting another man's fear. Yet when he finally pressed the file into my palm, his gaze bored into me, demanding something personal in return. "Promise me," he said, accent heavy, words chosen like stones. "Promise they will hear this, not just read." Distance felt vast in that moment, not measured in kilometers, but in the yawning gulf of disbelief I anticipated from Western desks. When I tried to reassure him, to say the warnings would go straight to Paris, London, Washington, a film of sorrow dulled his eyes. I had seen this expression before, in the haunted faces of refugees ringed by the dust-choked gates of Kabul. Massoud didn't believe me, not this time. Perhaps he never truly could. Still, he nodded, and in the gesture rested the tired formalities of one who remembers every previous envoy who'd promised the same. The wind rattled the tent flaps, scattering the faint radio signals that stuttered from the corner. In the moment, some part of me, trained to clock escape routes and exits, wondered whether I would get out before the pass closed. But Massoud was still speaking, voice growing firmer. If they ignore this, they will not be able to contain what comes next. They will be forced to choose between their values and their safety. That was the current running below every conversation in those years, a wager not of if, but when, the war would reach beyond these mountains. I remember my hand on the folder, feeling the papery damp where his grip had pressed. Outside, dusk pressed down until only the silhouette of men shifting weapons in the half-light remained. There were echoes, voices arguing in Dari, the percussive whine of jeeps starting up for a reconnaissance mission, the sound of wind knocking loose. The tarps stretched above command radios. The panorama conspired with his warning, framing it in nerves. What the West could not or would not see, Massoud carried alone. And there, in that tent, responsibility shifted, no longer theoretical, but immediate, tangible as the file in my hands. Every minute in that tent, I had weighed the cost of action against the inertia I knew awaited, back in the carpeted halls of embassies. Could I somehow sharpen his message, so it cut through institutional deafness? It was easy, in theory, to imagine urgent cables sprinting across the world, but in reality, routine would sand them down, layer urgency in language until only ambiguity survived. A gust swept through, raising a thin veil of dust across Massoud's maps. For a moment, skirmish fire echoed higher up the ridge, reminding us that every warning given tonight might be too late even now. My voice, when it returned, sounded hollow to my own ears. "They will see," I swore. "This time they must." He did not smile. Instead, he held me a little longer in that gaze, burdened as if measuring the sum total of all Western good intentions accumulating, weightless, in this valley. Later that night, alone in the cold of my guest quarters in the enclave, I pored over the pages. Each was a transcript, a diagram, a slim thread tying one clandestine cell to another, some in Pakistan, several names in the Gulf, all branching out like veins on frostbitten ground. One annotation, written in Massoud's looping script, circled a date near the top, September, danger escalates. That small detail chills me even now. The implication was unmistakable, and yet I could already sense the file's fate in the shapeless bureaucracy that would follow. Every communication out of Panjshir was scrutinized at the city gates of Kabul, where dust clouded the air thick enough to taste, and checkpoints set a rhythm to daily risk. I handed over Massoud's dossier, insistent, to a trusted courier heading to my embassy. My grip lingered, conscious that this folder represented a final hope, one that was already fraying at its edges. Days later, a reply came tumbling through a secure line by way of Paris. Subject under review. Local instability cited. No immediate action recommended. In that moment, disbelief curdled into understanding. I pressed for further attention, pleaded in confidential memos, and sat across polished tables where well-fed men chewed on the uncertainties as if weighing dinner menus. Inside me, something shifted. I replayed Massoud's words, the desperation, the certainty. Each echo of distant gunfire felt like a judgment, an omen reverberating past the shuttered windows of the enclave. Among diplomats, Massoud was a name often spoken with caution, rarely with respect. They saw him as a regional strongman, a fraction of a fractured land. I saw a man haunted by the future. I find myself returning to that final meeting in memory's dim corridors, straining to remember any sign that I could have pushed harder, chosen more disruptive words, broken the script assigned to me. I did not. None of us did. If, in that moment, irrevocable decisions were set in motion, they did not happen in the glare of daylight, but in the shadows, somewhere between a file pressed into my hands and an assurance given with too little faith. At intervals through the night, bursts of automatic rifles stitched panic into the wind outside my reinforced window. Each shot marked both a life interrupted and a cause unseen by the world beyond these mountains. If you ask me now why no one listened, why warnings from a valley scraped raw by wars never broke the inertia of distant capitals, I am left only with the memory of Massoud's tired face and the sound of that wind scattering hope across the stones. The turning point was not an event, but a quiet, irrevocable slide away from belief. Yet, a question remains, unresolved and heavy as the dusk over Panjshir. Was it ever truly possible for a single voice, forged in the crucible of endless conflict, to change the course of history? Or was the end already sealed, carried forward on winds that ignored borders and prayers alike? Echoes of those unheeded warnings would soon come crashing through the world's most impregnable facades. But for that night, their only witness was a courier on a dusty road, and a promise that shivered in the cold. In the valley, another sharp volley rang out, a warning sign, lost on all but those close enough to feel its tremor in their bones. There are moments in a man's life, and in the life of a nation, when sound itself shifts. When I first heard word of Massoud's assassination, it came not as a shout, but as a stifled whisper from one fighter to another. Every scrap of news in the valley traveled fast, carried across the cold ridges by battered radios and even quicker rumors. Yet this, the lion of Panjshir cut down days before the world would wrench itself awake, landed with a silence so profound that it seemed the resistance's breath had stopped. A biting wind howled down from the north as I entered the valley headquarters that afternoon. The dust had found its way into everything: rations, radio dials, the deep grooves of the commander's chair. A pair of Massoud's lieutenants stood by the flag-draped table, not speaking, their faces stony and pale. The normal pulse of chatter, a clatter of boots and laughter, sometimes even song, had shriveled to nothing but the distant staccato of gunfire far up the ridge. Even the birds kept to the shadows, as if mourning. Inside, the heavy wooden door opened to the echo of its own weight. Massoud's desk, so often scattered with half-read reports and hand-drawn maps, was utterly frozen in time. A mug of tea, stained and unfinished. His cap, resting where he'd last left it. A sheet of paper with a few lines in Dari. Nobody dared move any of it. To touch his things felt, somehow, like trespass. For a long moment, men stood awkwardly, afraid to disturb the pattern he had left behind. I tried to read that unfinished note, my eyes stinging from the grit and the grief. Beyond the compound walls, the scene in Kabul was stranger still, a surreal quiet, like an aftershock rolling through the diplomatic enclave. The city's normal racket, taxi horns, hawkers, the guttural shouts from checkpoint soldiers, had muted, replaced by something jagged and brittle. Every meeting took on the forced politeness of a wake. Maps on our tables had shifted meaning overnight. Alliances, once steady, suddenly looked insubstantial. No one wanted to be the first to articulate what we were all thinking. That the one man who had sounded the alarm again and again had just been snuffed out on the eve of catastrophe. Some diplomats whispered theories behind closed doors. An inside job, perhaps a failure of security, maybe a gruesome message sent by enemies both visible and hidden. Others busied themselves with reports, intent on burying their helplessness under paperwork. What most of us did not confess, or couldn't yet accept, was that Massoud's absence left a void that no urgent cable or late-night call could fill. We'd relied on his measured voice as a kind of northern star, a guide to both the promise and peril of Afghanistan's resistance. Now, uncertainty pushed in like smoke through the cracks of our compound. We awaited the next shoe to drop, certain only of our own powerlessness. At dusk, I returned to the Panjshir headquarters once more. The guards at the gate, boys, really, with rifles taller than their arms, nodded me through, their eyes red-rimmed and wary. As twilight painted the valley in shades of blue and shadow, I watched older resistance fighters kneel in prayer, their rifles set carefully out of reach. One of them, a grizzled veteran with an engineer's hands, stared at Massoud's empty chair, then quietly placed a folded telegram on the desk. It was a message from a European contact. Too little, too late. The gesture felt, to me, like a declaration of some irretrievable failing sent into the void. That night, wind battered the corrugated roof until it groaned. As I watched the lamp's flame shudder and nearly die, I realized how much we'd come to rely on Massoud's very presence, the sense that he would absorb chaos, that he'd bridge impossible differences with a few quiet words. Throughout the diplomatic community, his loss was not merely a tactical inconvenience. It felt, as I scribbled half-finished notes for a briefing to my own government, like we had all collectively missed the last warning. I kept circling back to my final meeting with Massoud. He had spoken softly, folding his hands on the battered map laid out on his desk. He warned that the forces massing beyond the horizon, Al-Qaeda-trained men and Taliban irregulars, would not stop with Afghanistan. Draw the lines where you wish, he'd told me. Their ambitions are borderless, and your response is bounded by illusion. I remember the raw flicker of urgency in his eyes, how he'd paused every now and then to listen for distant gunfire, almost as if expecting proof of his fears at any moment. But across the tables in Western embassies, Massoud had too often been read as another regional warlord, his warnings taken as bargaining chips, his intelligence discounted as regional paranoia. Some at the UN even dismissed his tone as alarmist, unable or unwilling to see the larger game. I remember, with a sting that never quite fades, how often key cables went unanswered for days on end, returned with little more than a bureaucratic nod. How easy it was to mistake caution for wisdom in rooms air-conditioned against reality. Sometimes, in those tense Kabul nights after the assassination, I would step onto the balcony and look out over the city, a city always fluttering between hope and deprivation, its skyline already dimmed by the approach of something none of us could name. Down in the alleys, kids darted between burned-out trucks, their laughter too thin and sharp. Somewhere in the distance, another exchange of gunfire broke the silence. There was still a resistance, yes, and still hope, but it moved with the doubled burden of loss and unheeded prophecy. Much later, rooting through a file box at Massoud's HQ, I found a battered cassette. The label had worn to near illegibility, scuffed away by dust and fingers. In the dark of a mountain bunker, I played it back, listened to his voice, steady, quiet, absolutely certain, outlining the patterns of global terror, as if reading tomorrow's headlines. The tape ended abruptly, the hiss of blank tape trailing into nothing. I nearly broke it, then set it aside, unable to decide if keeping it was an act of preservation or denial. There were moments after that, spread across the years and scattered nights, where I would wake suddenly, convinced I'd heard his voice again. Not a call to arms, not a plea, just the plain recitation of the facts that everyone else refused. The wind outside would whip sand against the window, and I would remember the chill in Massoud's HQ, that sensation of unfinished business pressing in from all sides. I wondered, each time, if any of us, myself included, could truly claim that failure was only ever institutional, or if the deepest blame belonged to those of us who heard and did nothing, who let the warnings fade with the wind. Yet, as that summer bled into autumn, we learned that an absence can become a summons. The gaps Massoud left, empty chair, ragged note, unclaimed command, became more than private grief. They were markers of an approaching storm, evidence that to doubt or delay was to be complicit in the world's undoing. Still, the question remained, why, when the rooms were full of intelligence and the air so ripe with signals, did no one truly listen until it was already too late? No answer came, then or now. The dust kept blowing, the city gates kept choking on their own inertia, and beyond the valleys, gunfire never really ceased. The world would pivot back to Afghanistan soon, forced to reckon with things we had been warned about, and chose not to believe. Afterward, when the world's eyes jerked toward Kabul in the smoke-wreathed wake of September 11, I found myself standing in the embassy archive, sifting through dispatches the color of dead leaves. Some were stamped urgent in a bold, ghostly hand. Others bore only the outline of a signature, fading in blue ink almost to invisibility. Every document now felt radioactive, its contents humming with the weight of unheeded consequence. Outside, the air hung heavy with the dust that rolled in from the streets, swirling in pensive eddies around the gates. Crowds pressed at the compound's wire perimeter, swelling and collapsing as rumors shot through Kabul like stray gunfire. The city sat taut, expectant, perched on the cusp between aftermath and retribution. There was a rhythm to it, even in its dread. But inside, amid the tangle of shredded cables and abandoned typewriters, regret lay thick as the soot that collected in every corner. I would trace my finger along a telegram, following the edges of words Massoud himself had tried to bring westward, warnings that would have landed like prophecy, if only we had recognized their true register. The text was clipped, worn down by its journey through censors and diplomats. Yet even inside its bureaucracy, honed restraint, there was a suppressed urgency that now screamed. It still chills me now, the memory of pressing that message flat against the desktop, reading, "Prepare for a wider terror. International intervention, or the world will bleed." The message was no longer hypothetical after the towers fell. We realized too late what had been encrypted in the syntax of caution and concern. That awareness struck with an ache that would claim its own space in every room I walked into for years. The first time I met Commander Massoud, it was in a half-lit sandbagged outpost north of the Panjshir. He looked, I remember, severe, dust-coated, hair wild in the mountain air. But it was the eyes that unsettled me. Clear, fixated, heavy with everything left unspoken. He spoke English rarely, but when he did, the words arrived methodically, chosen for their gravity. "You must help," he told me once, his gaze pinning me to my seat. "If I fall, darkness spreads." We listened, we nodded, but paperwork trumped warning. Massoud's missives were too direct, too uncomfortable. In those days, the West still believed Afghanistan's troubles belonged on the far horizon, something bracketed by preconceptions, easily cordoned off by geographical distance. I remember hearing colleagues in the diplomatic compound call him the Lion of Panjshir, but always with a kind of storybook detachment, as though he were a figure from another century. Heroic, yes, yet somehow outside our frame of consequence. But in those last weeks before everything changed, evidence built in layers I could have touched. There were satellite photos, intercepted phone calls, reports of men in beard and black turban moving across mountain passes. That summer, a battered folder crossed my desk, heavy with warnings from Massoud's network. The pattern emerged, but not quickly enough, and the urgency drowned in a tide of bureaucratic caution. It sounds impossible now, but I let my own doubts erode in the face of status quo. I filed away the folder with a silent sigh, stacking it beside bland diplomatic chatter and notes on reconstruction projects that would evaporate by autumn. The atmosphere in Kabul, then, was one of fragile, artificial calm. Smoke from charcoal fires curling through alleys, crowds navigating past heaped sandbags, until some echo of distant gunfire reminded us reality was always closer than we wished. There is a ritual to regret. Mine comes in the early hours, when conversation is just a memory, and I find myself alone in the archive. There, my breath fogs faintly on the glass of a security case, where a single physical relic remains. A transistor radio, battered but still alive with a hiss of static. I picked it up the morning after the attacks, weightless in my palm, and willed it to crackle with messages that might redeem the previous night's silence. Instead, it hummed only with the ghost of warnings never truly received. 3 nights after the attacks, the embassy guard captain, a sturdy, mustachioed man from Lyon, pressed a carbon copy telegram into my hand. This was not protocol, but nothing followed protocol now. The telegram was addressed not to politicians or generals, but to anyone who will listen. The message inside was unmistakably Massoud, a plea written weeks before his assassination. In it, he recounted the gathering strength of the Taliban, their unseen sponsors, and the ripple of terror reaching out beyond the Himalayas. The line that stopped me, the terror training here, is not only an Afghan problem. It is for the West. I stood in the fluorescent half-light of the file room, the telegram's ink staining my fingertips. That morning, I walked the perimeter of the compound, feeling the grit of dust against my boots and the distant staccato pop of gunfire carried on the wind from the outskirts. The signs were always visible, if you look straight at them, but it was easier not to. That was the lie we chose, the gravity of inaction disguised as prudence. Even now, I replay that moment, the world frozen between catastrophe and clarity, the embassy's walls thrumming quietly with the conversations we should have had. The air inside held the close metallic tang of fear, mingling with the burnt resin from incense scattered at the thresholds. Each breath seemed to taste both of lost opportunity and inevitability. Somewhere in the city, a distant mosque's call to prayer rolled out, echoing between ruins. Across town, traffic funneled through snarled checkpoints, their congestion throbbing with impatience and dread. Old women clutched handkerchiefs against the dust, while young men haggled heatedly over sacks of rice at the edge of the market. I remember thinking, the world narrowed in on these streets at last, but far too late to stop what had begun. When the first Western reporters arrived by battered SUV, I watched them from an embassy window. Their faces peered out, drawn and hollow with the news they'd carried in. New York in flames, Pentagon burning. One pressed his palm to the glass beside me, as if the cold shock of Kabul could somehow ground the chaos still burning at home. Only then did the diplomatic enclave grasp what the telegrams had always said. The mountain winds from the Panjshir had carried warnings for years, but we had mistaken them for static. There's a photograph I keep locked away in the bottom drawer of my desk, a copy slid to me by a French attaché months before the towers fell. In it, Massoud stands beside a battered field radio, his hand set lightly atop the receiver, as if coaxing coherence from the static. Behind him, mountains rise like the back of a crouched lion, their outline sharp against the pale Afghan sky. To anyone else, it is a portrait of a resistance leader in his element. But for me, it's a ledger of what slipped through our fingers. The radio, the telegram, the second-hand urgency. It all forms a trail of noise we learn to ignore at our own peril. Why did no one listen? That question roils through every account I revisit, every dust-laden folder I open. It is no rhetorical flourish, but a wound that refuses to heal. There were reasons, of course. Politics, disbelief, the illusion that disasters must announce themselves clearly before they break. And yet, every sensory detail from those days, the wind hissing through sandbag gaps, the acid taste of metals in groundwater, the vibration in the stone when a distant shell landed, reminds me. The warnings were always real, always present, only rendered invisible by our collective caution. Now, sometimes, that silence returns. The silence of the radio when I turn the knob, searching for voices that should have been louder. In the paper trail, in memory, the line between warning and catastrophe reveals itself only after it's been crossed. But consequences linger. Even now, standing in the ruined corners of the diplomatic compound, a telegram pressed to the glass, I find myself measuring every echo, every silence, for what it might have meant if we had only believed a man most thought they'd already figured out. Years later, the Panjshir winds still cut sharp through the valley, tugging at the canvas shrouded over Massoud's old headquarters. The old radio tower leans slightly now, as if bowing to the weight of memory. I stand on the gravelled approach, eyes stinging from the fine grit that rides the air, and everything around me whispers with echoes, unanswered questions, warnings adrift, the relentless pulse of loss. My breath emerges in clouds, thin and white against the dawn, carrying the scent of diesel and distant wood smoke. The stone steps underfoot are polished by years of rushed boots and weary hands, every one an imprint of urgency left behind, like a secret, urgent, then neglected. When I recall that spring in Panjshir, I think of Massoud at his map table, the lamplight pooling gold around rough paper and crumpled messages. He was never the type to fill a room with noise. There was always a hush to him, the kind that swelled right before a storm. On those afternoons, I would listen, scribbling, translating his pleas into language fit for embassies and risk-averse cabinets, words that, more often than not, withered somewhere in the space between Kabul and distant capitals. Each report was folded, sealed, driven down mountain roads choked with dust, and echoing with the rattle of machine gun fire in the far hills. Still, with every new courier sent, there was a flicker of hope. Across the table, Massoud's eyes tracked north, always, to the ridgelines where enemy patrols gathered, and beyond them, to the world that refused to see what was coming. We sat one frozen morning, frost teeth biting at the seams of the HQ. Massoud paused, glancing up from a message scrawled in French. He said quietly, "The world believes the threat is only here, that the fire cannot leap the mountains." I nodded, not a word in reply. This memory still stings, a moment where my silence feels heavier than anything I ever carried out of that valley. By then, Kandahar had fallen. Taliban banners, pale and lashing in sun, were reported fluttering on the city gates down south. We heard it first as rumors, Then, when confirmation snapped over the radio, all of us in that cramped radio shack went silent, except for the one man who stood and started shifting sandbags. Massoud's men left the radio on in the background, letting the static hum. It sounded, in that hour, almost like morning, except nobody was dead yet. The city of Kabul, 50 winding miles away, felt impossibly distant. Inside the diplomatic enclave there, gates had been reinforced, new checkpoints built. I remembered the metallic tang on the air, mixed with the scent of hastily poured concrete. We, the foreigners, shuffled between security briefings and candle-lit dinners, pretending the world outside those pale blue walls had not shifted beneath us. Every day, someone would slide a folder across the table with the latest dispatch from Panjshir. The warnings grew sharper, more frantic, as if somewhere, at the end of each letter, Massoud believed the right words could spark action where strategy failed. The folders piled up heavier by the week, but the response was always the same. Wait, reassess, gather more intelligence. One letter I will never forget. The paper was creased and sweat-stained, written not by Massoud himself, but by his young communications officer, a boy who could not have been more than 20. He pleaded for urgent support, weapons, aid, international recognition for their front. In the corner, a single fingerprint in dried blood. When I handed it off to a colleague at the embassy, she paused a moment, pressing her palm over the mark, as if she could feel the heartbeat on the other side of the page. We never spoke of it again, not even after it became clear, weeks later, that the boy who wrote it was among the dead after a raid on a mountain outpost. Regret grows in layers. It starts small, an unreturned phone call, a skipped meeting, a memo lost in translation. Then, one day, regret is the shape of an entire city, its gates chained and braced for what cannot be stopped. You find it etched in the eyes of checkpoint guards who used to be university students, in the shuttered shops on Shari-Nah, in the endless river of dust that sweeps through every broken window. Years slip by with new faces arriving, new missions declared, as the valley weathered siege after siege. We learned how warnings soften each time they are repeated, their urgency evaporating like rain on scorched stone. Outside the enclave, I saw evidence scattered everywhere. Satellite phones silent in locked drawers, maps with touchdown points circled in faint red pencil, photographs marked urgent, never pulled from their envelopes. Everyone, an artifact of a message sent and left unresolved. And yet, Massoud kept sending them. Even as assassination threats on his life mounted, even as the world's focus drifted back to Balkan summits and trade delegations, the same mountain winds whistled through his headquarters. On the last morning I saw him, Massoud set a mug of bitter tea in front of me and asked, quiet, deliberate, what will it take for them to understand? I wish I had told him the truth. Momentum had long been working against him, as if events now moved downhill and all we could do was watch. There was no single moment of breaking, only a drift, a slow hardening of indifference. And in this, the world revealed its greatest weakness, certainty that disaster would respect borders and that warnings spoken in valleys would fade before reaching marble halls. I carry an artifact still, a fragment of radio crystal, clear and unworn, meant to keep the field sets running through another winter. On the side, scratched with a pocket knife, is a date, spring of 2001. I pocketed it without thinking. The day I heard the final warning had been sent. That object, small and cold in my palm now as it was then, stands as proof. A signal lost in the wind, but not erased. Every so often, on a day like this, I press it against my chest to feel again that edge of urgency, regret, and hope that, for a few impossible months, kept us looking eastward for rescue that never arrived. Today, as I walk these courtyards, the silence is never absolute. There is always the echo of distant gunfire. You never forget the sound, no matter how many years pass. Faces graze by, lining the roads and market lanes, their eyes weighed by history they never asked for. They, too, search for answers in the ground dust, in the rust stains along the gates. The question lingers, why did so many refuse to listen when the warning was so clear? There are no more messages to deliver now, no more urgent briefings, no more hasty dossiers hurried through diplomatic channels. Only this, a hard, unforgettable lesson, written into every stone and carried on every wind that sweeps these valleys. When truth is spoken and no one listens, tragedy will not wait for permission to arrive. And in that knowledge, there must be a reckoning, not just for the leaders who turned away, but for all of us who saw the warning flare and let it fade into night. This is how I remember Massoud's final gift and his final cost, an elegy, not just for a commander, but for every warning the world chooses to ignore.